So Chris has got us placed right on this chart for how we originated. And we originated to solve some problems in the drug industry, in drug development. If you go back, I just want to make a few points off of this slide as well. We originated to solve problems in the drug industry, but as we expanded and launched, we found applications in essentially every other sector. So as we began working for not-for-profits, they no longer cared where the ownership was. They wanted it publicly available for solving problems like getting infrastructure into Africa or decreasing the spread of malaria in those countries and in the East. So we began expanding our model so that we included open interfaces, we included completely open source, and made these solutions widely available. You saw the little video with Larry Houston, and what did Larry Houston start off by saying? He says, the current model for R&D is not sustainable. Nowhere is that more true than in the industry that brings medicines to you, the industry that I grew up in, and I was painfully aware of its shortcomings and limitations. Now, one of the things that is not a limitation is human brain power. It turns out that we have a lot of excess human brain power. Look at this group here. I imagine that collectively this is a pretty smart group. I imagine individually this is a very smart group, but certainly collectively it's daunting. Here it is. It's on a Thursday evening in Spain. Are you telling me there's nothing else to do in Madrid than be in this room talking to other business people, executives, and a couple boring speakers? You know, there are movies to go to, there are kids to be played with, there are museums to see, there's great Spanish wine to be consumed. And yet here you are. In part because you have a choice as to how you deploy this cognitive surplus that you have, the stuff that's still working after your 8-hour day has been completed. Chris has talked about Wikipedia. I'll give you an interesting factoid about Wikipedia. All of Wikipedia was constructed, and they've gone back to deconstruct it, with the cognitive effort that represents 1% of 1 year of television watching by Americans alone. Okay? If you realize that if just the Americans for just 1 year would give up just 1% of their cognitive excess capability, they could produce Wikipedia. Look at how much unleashed mental capacity remains out there in the world. The secret is how to tap into it, how to create an architecture and a structure that would enable you to do it. So long after we had the thought that we wanted to access more minds to work on the problems related to human health, was the problem, what does one do? What kind of an organizational structure, what kind of an interactive device do I need to tap into that potential? And that became the fundamental problem of designing and launching Innocentive. See, I think I've got control here. Sometimes when you build something, you look back and you realize that you built it at the time based on what seemed like a good idea, but where did those ideas come from? And you realize those ideas had been bouncing around for some time. So this is what I consider the origins of Innocentive on May the 6th, 1975. Now, I'm dragging us way back. You don't have to see or be able to read or anything on that slide. It's just a picture to illustrate this point. It's a homework assignment that I did at Stanford in 1975. If I was to rewind the clock, I know some of you, it would have been a very short memory ago if you were thinking about your graduate school. Some of you probably a little longer ago. I don't know that there are many of us sitting in the room here who would have to rewind the clock. What does that come out to? 40 years and 5 months in order to get to this particular homework assignment. But I took this class And I'd been warned by anybody who'd ever taken the class before, and there was always a good rumor on campus, if you take this class, you must drop all other classes. It needs to be the only class you take. The average homework assignment requires 110 hours of research and library time. You're looking at page 1 of a 25-page document. It's going to require over 100 hours of library time. Tell your major professor that you're going to stop working in the lab for this one semester. Tell them it's Johnson's course. They'll understand. They all understand. They all know what has to be done to get through this particular class. So I get in the class, and the way it meets is you show up, they give you a homework assignment, you disappear, you spend somewhere between 80 and 150 hours in the library, depending on how lucky you got as you started looking, and then you come in and you submit your results. A week later, 2 days after you've submitted your results, there's going to be an evening meeting. We all gather in a room that was a little like this, except it was hexagonally shaped and not quite as large. We'd gather in what they called the gazebo, and the professor would go up, and there was a big chalkboard at the front, and he would write down the names of 5 people. If your name was up there on the chalkboard, it could be really good, or it could be really bad. Because if your name was up there, it could mean that you'd done something brilliant, and he wanted everyone in the class to learn that and to emulate that from that point onward. Or it could mean you'd done something really stupid, and he wanted you to never forget and never make that mistake again for the remainder of your career as a scientist. So you didn't know what the name meant. My name went up on this particular problem. It's good. It's good. Everything was good. It even says up there, good. I had other problems I could have picked, but I picked the one that had the good on it. But as I went back and I thought, now how did I do this problem? I realized that when I looked at the chemical structure that had not been successfully made yet, but they wanted us to propose how we would do it. This one down here with a little number 3, you don't have to see it too closely. But I looked at it and I realized just kind of how the atoms were arranged. And I thought about an experience with my father from when I was in the 2nd grade. I had wanted a Gilbert chemistry set, and a Gilbert chemistry set was a little bit expensive. And so my dad said, no, but I'm buying some empty bottles from the pharmacy, and I'm going to fill them with things. I'm going to write the chemical names and formulas on all these bottles. And one of the things that he filled the bottle with was cream of tartar out of my mom's kitchen cabinet. And he put the cream of tartar in there, and so I learned what the chemical formula for cream of tartar was, and I learned what the chemical shape was. And I looked at that molecule and I said, cream of tartar. There's a cream of tartar buried in here somewhere. And I started synthesizing and developing and looking up literature and supporting the arguments I made for transforming A into B and B into C, et cetera, et cetera. What I learned, the important thing wasn't that I got a problem right. The important thing I learned is that there were 20 of us in that class. And every time the class met, there were 20 unique solutions to the same problem. And this wasn't just 20 random people off the street. Of course, there'd be 20 unique solutions to the problem, some of which wouldn't make any sense. These were 20 people, well-trained, who'd taken the same sets of undergraduate courses, who'd done their preparation out of the same book, and we had 20 different approaches. Why? Because it came down to what you did one afternoon with your dad when you were 11 years old. It came down to what paper you had found interesting in the last edition of a journal that came out and you'd read it. It came down to all these completely idiosyncratic things that aren't on anyone's resume, aren't on anybody's list of coursework, and that determines how you solved an individual problem. But that's not the way we're taught to solve problems. That's not the way we're told we recruit the best problem solvers in the world. So 2.5 years later, I'm recruited by Eli Lilly. I join the company. I walk in. They hand me a problem. Well, it wasn't this problem, but it kind of looked like this problem. It looked about as much like this problem as anything that I did in this class or that I did for the company. And my first thought is, oh no, where are the 19 other guys? Because I know I'll come up with a solution to this problem. And maybe half the time it was a pretty good one. But the other half of the time, I was either up at the board being made fun of, or I was sitting there having basically not distinguished myself in any way, shape, or form. And so why was this company going to rely on me to solve all of its problems? It was going to become one sub-optimized solution after another because only I was assigned the problem to work on it. Well, naturally, I did what I could. I got 5 or 6 colleagues around. We brainstormed all of their problems that they were working on. We brainstormed all the problems I was working on. We tried to get this collection of minds going, and 6 wasn't very interesting. Well, move ahead. What is this? 20 plus years. Suddenly there's this new thing called the internet. Okay, there's this thing called Linux, and I'm looking at it, and I'm sitting with another colleague, a colleague by the name of Aaron, and Aaron and I are looking at this, and I'm thinking about my first day's assignment in the company. Where are the other 19 guys? And I realize I don't have to just get 19 guys. I don't have to just get the 6 that sat around me. I can get 19 million other people to look at this problem and think about this problem. But we had to create some kind of a structure. I couldn't obviously hire all 19 people. That would have bankrupted us on the first problem that we attempted to solve. So I stole an economic model from the old Wild West, bounty hunting, in which, you know, you could pay the Pinkertons to go out and track down the Wild Bunch. That was Butch Cassidy. I think that was Butch Cassidy, and yeah, that's Butch Cassidy, the Sundance Kid, and their cohorts. You could pay the Pinkertons to go out and track them down, or you could just stick their pictures up on the sheriff's wall, put an amount that it was worth, $500 each, and see if somebody brought them in. So why wouldn't that work with a financial problem? Why wouldn't that work with the marketing problem? Why wouldn't that work with a scientific problem? I mean, why can't we bounty hunt these problems as if they were outlaws? Put the value that it is up there and see if anybody is willing to work on it. We had some language that's on the right-hand side that's, you know, I grabbed a slide from that day, but that language is kind of inside the conversations that we were having. Innocentive then became the first time a certain type of experiment was run in the world. And that experiment was, have you ever noticed how when they gave the Nobel Prizes out earlier this year, that the medicine prize went to a doctor, and the physics prize went to a physicist, and the chemistry prize went to a chemist? And of course that's the way it is. Those are experts. Those are how problems are solved. Maybe that's not true. Maybe chemists get the Nobel Prize in chemistry because they're the only ones working on chemistry problems. And maybe physicists get the physics prize and Nobel Prize in physics because they're the ones working on physics problems. That the answer was just a pre-selection process as to which problem you worked on. Well, we could test that. So Innocentive has now posted over 2,000 problems, okay? So this isn't like a one-off. These aren't small numbers in which you can make some statistical argument against it. We've now done it 2,000 times, and every time we post, we don't select who they go to. We broadcast them to this very wide network that's got skills in multiple areas. And when the answers come in, before we show them to the organization, that organization could be the United States Department of Defense, it could be a not-for-profit charity looking to cure Alzheimer's disease, it could be a corporation, it could be Procter & Gamble. Procter & Gamble's been one of our big customers. When we give them the solutions that came into these problems, we have a little game we like to play. You don't get to know who submitted it. You don't get to know what gender they are. You don't get to know what nationality you are. You don't get to know who they're affiliated with. You don't get to know anything on their resume about what their skill sets are. So here's my quiz. What percentage of the time do you think they select as the best answer that came in an answer that came from someone who, after this information was revealed to them, they looked at the resume and said, yeah, I would never have been able to find that person, but that's the kind of person that has the skills that I think would have solved this problem. Throw out some numbers. What percentage of the time do you think the expert solved the problem? 5%. Pretty skeptical about experts over here. 5%. Huh? 60? 60%. That sounds like a person who's attending an open innovation seminar and doesn't want to make the number too high. 50? 20? Turns out it's somewhere between what the two of you have called. It's 10-ish. It's 15 for a run for a while, and it's down around 6 for a while, and it bounced around there. The experts are all given an equal access to it, but we have a lot of reasons that we've gone into. We've worked closely with Harvard and MIT to try to explain, gee, we thought we understood how problems were solved. They were solved by experts in the field. How are they actually solved? And we're getting continually emerging theories. Has to do with the fact that, well, they're just far more non-experts than experts. So you're going to get a little bit of just the number of players, shots on goal kind of a thing. Monkeys typing Shakespeare, that sort of thing. You get a lot of things going on, and it's going to fall outside that normal construct of expertise. Maybe one of the more interesting theories is the theory of optimal marginality, which says that whenever you're trained in a field how to do the work of that field, inadvertently they're training you how not to do it. They can't help it. But when they tell you you do it like this, they're also saying, and you don't do it all those other ways. And it turns out that if these problems haven't been solved in that field, then it's probably because they need to be done in one of those other ways. And so it's somebody who is marginal. They're not well trained in the field. There might be a biologist solving a physics problem because biologists approach things in a different kind of way. Now I'm just going to wrap up with one more slide and an example. Kind of sprinkled a few examples in along the way. If you feel like, oh, it's 25 years old, if it hasn't happened, it's passed us by, I can tell you, as somebody deep in this field, this stuff is at baby steps stage. The company that will be the winning company when we look back on it 50, 80, 100 years from now will be the company that orchestrates the innovation channels, just like you're expecting today your marketing department to orchestrate all the different marketing channels. If somebody said, well, TV always worked great, we're just going to do TV and we're not going to try anything else, you'd be pretty disappointed in that executive. Believe me, you kind of tolerate that behavior when it's your chief scientific officer or your CTO. And that's essentially what they're telling you is, we know how innovation occurs. It's a delicate, it's a fragile process. You've got to nurture some of these wacky employees along that are hard to manage and irascible and everything else, but we've got the way of doing it. We don't need to look outside. We don't need to look at these different, but they represent different modes of innovating, just as social media, print media, television, billboards, etc. represent different modes of advertising. As part of what we've tried to do, because we tell people, no, incentive's not the answer to everything. Incentive's only the answer to a thin slice of the kinds of problems that you work on. But there are other kinds of things. There are offshoring decisions. There are university contracts. There's consultancies. There's establishing risk structures and joint ventures and rights of first refusal. There's a lot of ways in which you open up your innovation capabilities to the world, And we've even tried to make sense. Now, you know, we don't have a handout or anything, but we can always make sure that you get pointed to this direction. So the slide I skipped over, I'll back up because it lets me tell a story, and I wanted to end with a story. NASA came to us, and NASA's been working for 30 years on a problem that's very important to astronauts, which is, if I've got to climb out of my vehicle in a flimsy little thing that looks like a Halloween costume and work on the exterior of the craft, I'm subject to radiative bombardment from the sun. And over time, that bombardment is going to have physical consequences to me. I want to know what the radiation output of the sun is at any given time I'm scheduling my extravehicular activity. This is basically saying, could you please, NASA, predict the weather on the sun so that I can come out when it's cloudy and not when it's sunny? Well, the problem is we know how well we predict weather on the Earth, and believe me, predicting weather on the sun is not an easier problem. It's just a much bigger problem, and it's much further away. So NASA's been working pretty much nonstop on this problem for 30 years. They came to us. After 30 years of work on this problem, they said, we'd like you to tackle it in a completely new way. So we said, okay. We took all the information they had, we constructed a challenge of it, we posted it. You know, we basically did the wild bunch stuck on the sheriff's wall, and we invited all comers to come in. They took the results of that, NASA did, and they ran it against the standards of prediction that they already had, and they found a few algorithms that beat them. One that was doing substantially better than what NASA had done. Now, what you see here is we prepared some stuff for NASA on a package of challenges they'd issued with us, and we wanted to show them where the thinkers, where were the minds located that were working on this. And I can tell you there were several of these locations that NASA didn't have any contractors or anyone in. We have far greater reach than NASA had ever hoped. But it turns out that the winning solution, and then we unblinded, and they said, nah, we'd have never hired that guy for working on a problem like this. He's a sprint engineer. You know, he's never done anything in space or aeronautics or anything else. He's never done anything involving sun behavior. But this sprint engineer dusted off one of his old graduate school papers in which he had thought about the way the magnetic field of the Earth couples with the magnetic field of the sun. And it turns out that by instilling that coupling constant into his weather predictions, he was able to predict these particle flows. How long did we work on this problem after NASA did it for 30 years? We worked on it for 120 days before we could come up with a solution that was better than what they'd worked on for 30 years. But in parallel processing, if you realize that all of these were working on it for 30 days, we put an enormous amount of effort in. We just did it in parallel so that NASA would have an answer in months rather than decades. And with that, Chris, I'm going to turn it back over to you.